video tour of Coburg Cemetery. My name's Julie Stratford.
And I'm Lee Anthony.
And we're going to take you on a tour of Coburg Cemetery. We are from Friends of Coburg Cemetery. We do run tours regularly, but this is our very first pre-recorded tour, so we hope you enjoy it. First of all, before we start off, we'd like to acknowledge that this is the land of the peoples of the Kulin Nation and the Wurundjeri-Wurrung tribes. This is the traditional land, and they are the traditional custodians of the lands and the waterways of this area. And we pay respect to their elders, past, present and emerging, and as well as to all nations communities who significantly contribute to the life of this area and our community. I'm sitting next to the grave of Ron and Ruby Maloney. We learned about Ron and Ruby from their grandson Warren Maloney, who sent us the information. So thank you for that, Warren. In fact, Ron and Ruby were better known by the name Testro, the tossing Testros. They were acrobats and they were involved in juggling and balancing acts. They travelled all over the world as quite famous acts in casinos and in theatres and dance halls, and they were well known because of their amazing feats of balancing and juggling and dancing, and they were an amazing couple. Ruby comes from a family of interesting people, of performers as well. Her mother was Zinger Lee, the famous fortune teller from the Eastern Market. Her dad was actually murdered at the Eastern Market in 1899. And Ron Maloney and the Maloney family had a long history of being involved in the theatre. This is the grave of Saeed Shah, who was the leader of the Muslim community at the time when he died. He was murdered. There was a nasty neighbourhood dispute where he was in conflict with his landlord, and basically the landlord shot him. He later claimed he was just trying to scare him. He didn't know if the gun was loaded, he was just aiming through his leg, but he in fact shot him in the belly, and so he died. And later on, you know, the newspaper reports talked about maybe it was self-defense. There was a massive funeral with people in fantastic exotic costumes that were reported in newspapers afterwards. But Saeed had been a very important character in the Muslim community. It was 1911 that he died, so it was over 100 years ago.
I want to talk about the grave, Julie, because it is interesting. It has a couple of rather unusual features. One of it is Saeed's headstone is in the form of the Asian style, which was often used with the Chinese that were buried around that era, even though the language is in English, so it's easy to read. It also has a fairly classic Victorian surround. It's got this wonderful arbour on the top, and we suspect there's a couple of those here in Coburg, but we suspect that they were placed here in order to grow roses over the graves. We don't have any roses over graves, unfortunately, anymore, but the arbour here is in very good condition and still stands, which is good. So we get the opportunity to see what these graves would have been like. I think he was a well-loved, well-respected gentleman at the time, and his loss was considered significant, especially in the area in which he did die.
Many of you will have heard of Frank Costigan QC and the Anti-Corruption Commission that he ran in the 80s. As one of the newspaper reports about his death in 2009 had said, Frank Costigan QC made many more friends than enemies, but his enemies were exceptional. Costigan was active in the Labor Party, and in the 80s, Malcolm Fraser, the Prime Minister at the time, put him in charge of the Royal Commission into criminal activities in the Painters and Dockers Union. He found some serious criminals had infiltrated the union, and their activities, often violent crimes, were to benefit wealthy individuals. He said in his report that some of these criminals did not hesitate to kill. And amongst the crimes he uncovered were various forms of fraud and theft, extortion, massive importation of drugs, shipments of armaments, all manner of violence and murder. Frank and his team followed the stench of corruption into the offices of some big names, where he uncovered a tangle of dodgy tax evasion schemes referred to in the papers at the time as bottom of the harbour schemes. Before the Royal Commission's report was finalised, the newspapers leaked excerpts that referred to a prominent Australian businessman, codenamed Goanna. The businessman was allegedly involved in tax evasion, organised crime, drug trafficking, pornography and murder. It turned out to be Kerry Packer. Packer denied it all, and his lawyer, a bright 30-year-old Malcolm Turnbull, accused the Commission of a misuse of power, and he got off. At Kerry Packer's funeral in 2006, his son James threw some more mud at Costigan, saying that the Packer family had never forgiven Costigan. Costigan publicly responded that as a Royal Commissioner, he simply investigated. He didn't make allegations or prosecute. And the CEO of Jesuit Social Services, who Costigan continued to work with until a few months before he died, described Frank Costigan QC as someone with great insight, great intellect and great compassion. And he had a wicked sense of humour, just a bit of a glint in his eye, an Irish leprechaun kind of thing. It was a pretty wonderful mix.
I'm standing next to Arthur Edison Jenkins, who has one of the most impressive headstones in Coburg Cemetery, in my opinion, made from local source bluestone from Coburg Lake and imported white marble. More importantly is the symbols used on this particular grave. So we've got a full nautical representation that's more often seen at grave sites at St Kilda Cemetery or Williamstown Cemetery. But this one here at Coburg is kind of interesting. Firstly, we don't know an awful lot about Arthur Jenkins. Some of us have tried to research his story. We just can't find any details about him. We have a beautiful coiled rope as the front piece. We have the buoy and safety net on the side. The other side is the ship's wheel. We have the capstan, we have the rope, we have the captain's hat, which is beautifully sculpted, and of course the laurel of the fallen. It really is a very impressive headstone at Coburg. Most people aren't aware it's here because, believe it or not, it's in the low part of the cemetery. And if anyone knows any information about Mr. Jenkins, it'd be terrific. Get in touch with us. I'm sitting here beside one of Coburg's fallen angels. The headless angel sitting in the grave that has been smashed in is of the Hayward family. It's unfortunate that some cemeteries do have a damage that occurs either through weather, deterioration, storms and winds, because the angels aren't always protected, or vandals. In this case, the Hayward family has been the victim of all of those incidents. It's regrettable that the angel's been lost because it's one of the few we have in the cemetery that's actually writing in a ledger. We'll try and get that footage for you in a sec. But if you get the opportunity to walk through and have a look, it might seem disgraceful to leave it, but the people who own this grave are the Hayward family, and they're the ones responsible for any repairs. If you're out there, by all means get in touch. Let's go to another grave.
Isaac Mattsson was born in Finland in 1818, and like a lot of men, he flocked to the goldfields in California and became one of the 49ers in 1849. He was in California on the goldfields. Not long after that, obviously he wasn't that successful because he ended up coming to Victoria, to the Victorian goldfields, and was in Ballarat. He was there at the Eureka Stockade. He was obviously not fabulously successful at finding heaps of gold, but his family still actually have some jewellery made from the gold that he did find. He lived nearly 100 years, and so it wasn't until 100 years ago that he was buried here in the Coburg Cemetery. One of the other things I always like to point out about this grave, apart from the fact that Isaac's sounds like he's got a fascinating story and he's one of the oldest people buried here at Coburg, is that his stonemason obviously couldn't spell. So that is not how you spell California. I'm now standing at the graveside of the Anquetel family. William and Thomas Anquetel are both buried here, and William was Thomas's father. It's Thomas's story that I find most fascinating, and a lot of people who've been on our tours before will have heard me talk about Thomas Anquetel. Apart from the fact that Thomas was the bank clerk at a bank in Denali, who actually received the Welcome Stranger, the world's largest gold nugget found at the time in the 1860s. He was the bank clerk who actually weighed and worked out the value of the Welcome Stranger gold nugget, which is just one small piece of his story. But Thomas is actually more famous for having been a murder victim. He was the bank manager at the bank in Merri-bek, which is a small area in West Australia, north of Perth, in an area that's very hot and dry. And he and the bank clerk both lived in the premises above the bank in the town. But it was a very hot night. It was a place where it's often 40 degrees all day long. It was dry and hot. And because it was so hot, they had beds set up on the veranda around the edges of the bank and were sleeping out on the veranda where it was cooler. And somebody, and to this day we still don't know who, broke in, murdered both the guys, and strangely didn't steal anything. The only damage that had occurred was that some paperwork had been burnt. The murders of the two guys, both Thomas and his bank clerk, were really vicious, and you know, I often say it almost, that the descriptions in the newspapers almost sound like a crime of passion, but there was certainly an element of viciousness about the murders of these two guys. And you know, it would have been the hottest news topic in the region at the time. It was around about 1885, I think it was, and there's a whole website that someone has put together with a whole lot of newspaper clippings and information about the murders, and they never did find out who did it. There was suspicion cast on the local Chinese community, which was sort of fitting with the racism of the time, and also the friend of the bank clerk. But it does kind of sound like maybe someone just needed their debt papers destroyed, but in the doing they committed a really awful crime. A year later, after he was buried in the Merri-bek Cemetery, William and his family brought Thomas's body home to be buried here in Coburg Cemetery, closer to home, and then later on, William himself, who had been a magistrate as well as a local farmer, was buried here as well. So a fascinating story. We've got loads more information about them. If you're interested, ask some questions and we'll let you know. Let's go and meet somebody else.
I'm standing beside one of the one of the servicemen's graves here at Coburg. It's on the northwest side of the cemetery. I apologise for the noise behind me. This is Elizabeth Street behind us. We have a large number of these graves that have been refurbished over the last few months, and the reason is the Office of the Australian War Graves Service are acknowledging the loss of a number of men who died just before disembarking to go overseas in 1915. So they'd all done their basic training, were ready at Camp Road Army Camp, ready to leave, and a tonsillitis epidemic broke out, a measles epidemic broke out, and a typhoid epidemic broke out. So what ended up happening was a large number of these men, some of them from New Zealand as well, passed away, and because they were ready to disembark, the Australian War Service acknowledged that they were active soldiers doing their duty and died as part of their duty. So a lot of them are now being represented with these wonderful graves that the Australian War Service Graves Office actually creates. It's been a lot of work in Coburg. So if you're in the area, you'll see there's a large number of them that have been established.
Snowy Cutmore was a gangster who killed Squizzy Taylor. Most Melburnians know and have heard of Squizzy Taylor. Not many have heard of Snowy Cutmore. Snowy was brought up in a rough and tumble world with a lot of crime under his belt before he was even out of his teens. He had a pretty hard life, but he made life pretty hard for a lot of other people too. Here's an excerpt from an article written by Shane Maloney, one of our local crime authors, published in the Monthly in September 2013. After an afternoon scouring the pubs of Carlton, Taylor found Cutmore at home in bed with a dose of influenza, tended to by his dear old mum. Cutmore, who'd just returned to Melbourne to avoid a murder rap in Sydney, had a gun under his pillow. The confrontation was brief. Squizzy drew, bullets flew, and Snowy died on the spot, nicking his mother's shoulder with a stray shot in the process. Taylor fled mortally wounded and expired soon after at St Vincent's Hospital.
Standing beside one of the many graves in Coburg of footballers, particularly Collingwood footballers. Jock McHale, I think, is known by most, but we'd like to maybe suggest that in the future we will do a footballers tour. That's how many we've got here at Coburg Cemetery. Lucky us. Go Storm.